joining here, but thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, everyone. We're really excited to have you here and to be hosting this webinar with you. My name is Michelle Loth, pronouns she, her, and I'm on WELC's development team. We do have a lot of new folks joining us today, so in case you're not familiar or not on our email list or whatnot, the Western Environmental Law Center, or WELC, is a nonprofit public interest law firm, and we work with over 180 or so clients and partners free of charge. And our mission is to use the law to foster thriving, resilient Western lands, waters, wildlife, and communities in the face of a changing climate. We host these calls pretty regularly throughout the year, featuring WELC staff, WELC board members, and special guests discussing just a variety of topics related to our work. So definitely do sign up for our email list if you're not already on that, just to keep tabs on all of that and different ways to stay engaged and show up right now. It's just, as we all know, a really critical time to be showing up in the world in whatever capacity that you have available. So stand up and make your voice heard. And yeah, we're just happy that folks are taking the time today to join. So before we do jump into it, I wanted to just go over a couple quick housekeeping notes, just to minimize background noise. I had mentioned, but we do ask that everyone stay muted unless you're asking a question. Yeah, we just want to keep out, this call is being recorded, so keep out all that background noise. But if you needed to ask a question during the call or had a burning question, feel free definitely to type it into the chat. And we will try and circle back to that at the end of the call. And we do have planned time for questions at the end of the call, so we will be offering that up at that time as well. And then lastly, we will be raffling off a stainless steel WELC cup, just as a thank you for showing up. So stay tuned for that at the very end. And so with that, I think we can go ahead and jump into the webinar featuring award-winning author Ben Goldfarb and conversation with Sristi Kamal, WELC's Deputy Director and longtime wildlife advocate. So Ben is an independent conservation journalist and the author of Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, named one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times, and his award-winning book, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. Which I know I can say for myself and likely many other folks on this call that the book definitely kickstarted my Beaver Believerhood era. So if you haven't read either of Ben's books, we all highly recommend them. They're excellent reads, and yeah, it can be a pivoting book for conservation. So, and then also we have Sristi Kamal, WELC's Deputy Director, and she is a conservation practitioner with a special focus on human dimensions of wildlife, conservation, and science-based policy advocacy. Over her career, she has worked with Indigenous communities, landowners, and rural communities to address complex conservation and livelihood issues. She continues her policy advocacy work with public agencies and at legislatures to further WELC's mission. So super, super excited to have both of them on the call today. And one last announcement before we begin, I'm going to hand over to WELC Development Director, Jenna Klaupel. So go ahead, Jenna, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Michelle and I have been tracking our attendance this past week, and I think we can officially declare that this is our largest or our best attended call ever. And I wanted to also especially thank Ben for lending his expertise and his unique insights to the call. Before we start, I want to share a little bit of information about our organization. You're going to hear today, as Michelle mentioned, from our Deputy Director, Sristi, specifically her efforts largely situated in the world of policy. The bulk of our work, however, is undertaken by around 20 staff attorneys at Western Environmental Law Center. We do that work as a pro bono nonprofit law center, meaning we offer our legal services free of charge to our partners and clients. We're able to do that with support from donors, foundations, and somewhat with legal fees from court victories. So if Sristi's work resonates with you today, I hope that you'll consider making a gift to WELC, or signing up to our email list to hear about our incredible work throughout the year, including future updates on Sristi's work. I'll drop our donation page in the chat as well as a link to sign up to our email list. And I hope that we all will stay in touch. I will hand it over to Ben now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenna and Michelle, for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here this morning. As Michelle mentioned, I'm the author of a couple of books, one about beaver restoration and one about road ecology and wildlife crossings and habitat connectivity. I've actually never spoken about those two seemingly disparate topics in combination before. But they're both core to the work that WELC does and core to the work that Sristi personally does. And so we'll attempt the high flying, high wire act of combining these two topics today. And we'll start with beavers, everyone's favorite keystone rodent, because they're just, again, so I think core to a lot of the work that WELC has done over the years. Beavers, of course, are semi-aquatic rodents, right? They spend their whole lives in and around the water. They're North America's largest rodent. Typical adult beaver is 40 to 60 pounds. So they're quite a bit bigger, I think, than a lot of people realize. And they're totally herbivorous animals, right? They don't eat fish. Their primary dietary staple is cambium, right? That's the inner bark of trees like aspen and cottonwood and willow. And they cut down those trees for a couple of reasons. First, to eat that bark, which is their primary food supply, but also to use the wood as construction material, right? And I know a lot of you are in the Oregon, the beaver state, and so maybe it's maybe the work that beavers do on the landscape is second nature to you. But I think you can't overstate just how important beaver dams are as ecological features, right? Beavers build dams to kind of engineer their own habitat. Essentially, a beaver out on land is vulnerable to predators like wolves and cougars. So by building that dam and creating that nice deep pond and wetland, they're just creating and enhancing their own shelter. But in the process, they're providing some pretty incredible ecological services for other species and for us humans as well. And that's why we care about these animals so much, or at least a big part of why we care about them. Here's for example, a single 300-acre beaver pond storing millions of gallons of water created by one strategically placed beaver dam at the narrow outflow of a canyon. And beavers are what scientists call keystone species, right? Animals who disproportionately support a lot of weight in aquatic ecosystems. We know that here in the American West, wetlands cover around 2% of land area and support something like 80% of biodiversity. So any animal that's building and expanding and maintaining wetlands is incredibly ecologically important. It's almost hard to name a species that doesn't benefit from beavers at some point in its life cycle, but we know that other semi-aquatic mammals like muskrat and moose and otter and mink are beaver beneficiaries. Here in Colorado, we've got native cutthroat trout whose juveniles really favor beaver ponds. Out there in Oregon, where a lot of you folks are, of course, salmon like coho and especially coho and steelhead as well are big beaver beneficiaries. Another cool beaver connection are with amphibians. Right here in Colorado, our critically endangered amphibian is the boreal toad, and something like 90% of boreal toad breeding occurs in beaver ponds. This is basically a beaver pond obligate, right? So beavers provide this fantastic habitat for fish and birds and mammals and amphibians. And they also provide lots of wonderful environmental benefits and services for us humans, right? Beavers are fantastic drought mitigators. They're creating thousands of little reservoirs up in the high country, keeping water on the landscape as we lose our snowpack. Here in Colorado, I think we're something like 50% of our typical yearly snowpack right now. So we're in dire water trouble, and we need some way of maintaining water on the landscape. And beavers do that for us, not just surface water rather, but groundwater as well, right? When you look at a beaver pond, you see all of that visible water that's being stored behind those dams. But what you don't see is all of the water spreading out onto the floodplain, soaking into the ground, recharging those aquifers, hydrating soils, raising the water table. So that combination of ground and surface water storage that beavers provide for us is one of the things that makes these animals so vital. Beavers are fantastic flood mitigators, right? And I think that's a little counterintuitive to people. We think about beavers as being animals who cause flooding, not attenuate it. But, if you picture a big snowmelt event or a big rainstorm, all of that water is racing downstream, damaging stream banks, tearing out irrigation ditches or houses in some cases. And then that stormwater hits that beaver wetland complex, and it spreads out onto the floodplain, and it's stored in the pond itself, and it sinks into the ground. And there have been studies showing that up to 30% of these big runoff events can be attenuated by individual beaver colonies in some streams. This is a beaver pond in Scotland where Eurasian beavers have been reintroduced largely for their flood control benefits. So I think that's a little bit magical to contemplate, right? We have these two polar opposite problems on the hydrograph, drought and flood, and beavers help us manage both of them by stabilizing those flows. Beavers are fantastic agents of pollution filtration, right? Streams racing along, it's carrying nitrates and phosphates and heavy metals and all of these other contaminants, and then it hits that beaver pond, slows down, loses its kinetic energy, and those suspended solids settle out and are captured in many layers of sediment. And there have been lots of studies showing that beavers improve downstream water quality. They're also great carbon sequesterers for the same reason, right? They're capturing lots of carbon-rich organic matter in their ponds as well. And then the final, really important beaver benefit that I just wanted to highlight this morning is they're great firefighters, right? It turns out that water doesn't burn, and by spreading water out and hydrating plants, beavers are creating these really lush, green, wet, blue, drought resistant or fire resistant rather valley bottoms. And here's one example of that. This is the Sharps Fire in Idaho a few years back, and you can see all of those uplands have just been burnt to a crisp, but that beaver-mediated valley bottom is still beautifully intact. And in fact, Emily Fairfax, a great beaver fire researcher, has proposed that the U.S. Forest Service change its mascot from Smokey Bear to Smokey Beaver. That's just how good these animals are at fighting fires. So, today we have something like 10 to 15 million beavers in North America. They're certainly not an endangered species, but that number, which seems relatively large, is actually a tiny fraction of how many beavers used to exist on this landscape. We know at the time of European arrival, we had several hundred million beavers in North America, all building dams and creating unfathomable numbers of ponds and wetlands. And so if we're going to get back something resembling our historic beaver population, especially in Western states where we probably have 5 to 10% of our historic beaver numbers, we really need to figure out how to live alongside these animals. And that's not always easy, right? Beavers and humans tend to inhabit the same sorts of places. We both like low gradient stream corridors and broad fertile floodplains. That's where they build their dams, and that's where we put our roads and railroads and power lines and other infrastructure. And there's no question that when beavers and humans overlap and interact, conflicts can occur. I'd argue that we're the nuisance species more than they are, but certainly these can be difficult animals to live with. Here's just probably the most archetypal form of beaver conflict in North America, which is damming and road culverts, right? If you're a beaver, the roadbed is like the world's greatest dam, and the culvert is the leak in the dam, and beavers plug leaks. That's what they do. So the water rises and the road washes out, and it's this big headache to maintain. And and there's just one funny aside is that recently the Onion had this great headline report: more Americans moving away from urban areas for rural life where they can have escalating feud with beaver. That's how you know that your issue has really made it in the national consciousness, right? When the Onion runs a story about it. So just to say that these sorts of beaver conflicts are pretty frequent and probably increasing in occurrence as beaver numbers gradually tick up. And unfortunately, the vast majority of those conflict cases are handled lethally, right? We know that USDA Wildlife Services kills something like 25,000 beavers every year, and private nuisance trappers kill certainly tens and possibly hundreds of thousands of beavers more. We don't really know. And the issue with that reflexive, lethal approach to beaver management, I would say, is twofold. First, of course, when we kill those beavers, we're eliminating that great pond and wetland habitat that we care about so much. But also, all we're doing is putting up a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as that culvert, is still there, beckoning to them, they're always going to come back, and those problems are going to reoccur. And so, all over this country, especially in the West, we're engaged in this expensive, time-consuming, ecologically nonsensical cycle of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization. So you start to ask yourself, maybe there are better ways of living with these animals and coexisting with them. And we've got all kinds of great options for beaver coexistence. One frequent reason that beavers get killed is tree felling, and I just don't think that any beaver should ever be killed for cutting down a tree. That's just too easy a problem to solve with a bit of heavy gauge wire fencing. When the issue is flooding, that can be a little bit trickier, but there too we've got great options. This is a guy named Skip Lyle, inventor of the Beaver Deceiver, which is part of this broader category of contraptions called flow devices, which are basically these pipe and fence systems. You run the pipe through the beaver dam or into the culvert, and you just drain the level of that pond a little bit so that it's not flooding the road or the field or whatever infrastructure you're trying to protect. So this is a great way of striking a balance between the needs of the beavers and the needs of human beings. And here's another example of beaver coexistence, just a great culvert protection fence built by Mike Callahan, who's the president of the Beaver Institute and a real leader in beaver coexistence. So we've got all kinds of fantastic options for living alongside these animals rather than killing them at the drop of a hat. So to sum it all up, we have this fantastic animal, provides all of these wonderful ecosystem benefits and services for other species and for us humans. And all we have to do is kind of get out of the way and let the rodent do the work, as the mantra of the Beaver Believer goes, right? Let's stop killing these animals, figure out how to live with them, and that's certainly something that Sristi is going to talk about. So I was thinking earlier about what sort of unites the two topics that I've written about and that we're talking about today: beavers and the impacts of roads on wildlife. And I think that one of the nexuses that I love talking about, maybe because it's just so niche, something that not a lot of people think about every day, are road culverts, right? And culverts are those pipes that funnel water and streams under roadways and railroads. And as I mentioned earlier, beavers love plugging up those culverts, and culverts are constantly getting plugged with debris and blowing out. So they're this huge vulnerability in our infrastructure, in a sense, but they're also an opportunity for wildlife. They're potential wildlife crossings. We have something like 2 million culverts here in the US, and a lot of those get appropriated by animals. And there are lots of things we can do with that existing infrastructure that's already on the landscape to make them even better for wildlife. So here's one neat example of habitat connectivity using culverts. This is a culvert in Montana under Highway 93. Not a pipe that was built for wildlife, but animals are really good at finding opportunities to cross roads safely. And this pipe gets used by skunks and weasels and bobcats and all kinds of critters. The problem is that in the spring the water comes up, the bottom of the culvert gets flooded, the animals don't want to use it. So what the Montana Department of Transportation did in this case was they put in what they call a critter shelf, this metal catwalk that runs the length of the culvert so that those terrestrial animals can use it year round. And providing those safe crossing opportunities for wildlife is so important. And something that I think we don't as a society think about nearly as much. For us humans, roads are these ubiquitous features of the landscape, right? They're so abundant. We have something like 4 million miles of road here in the U.S. We use them every day. They're fundamentally useful, right? They're how we get to hospitals and grocery stores and schools and all the places that we want to get to. They have these cultural connotations of freedom and mobility and momentum. But for all of the freedom and mobility that they provide us humans, they deny other animals the opportunity to move around the landscape at a pretty massive scale. The way they do that primarily is through roadkill. More than a million animals are killed, vertebrate animals. We're not talking about butterflies or bees here, just mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians are killed by cars every day in the U.S. Including dozens of federally threatened and endangered species. So this is a profound conservation problem. And it's also a public safety problem. We know that there are several million large animal crashes with white-tailed deer and elk and mule deer and other black bears, other big critters. More than 400 drivers are killed in deer collisions alone every year. And all of those large animal crashes inflict more than $10 billion of damage to vehicles and human health and safety every year. So this is this huge public health and safety crisis, as well as being a really significant conservation crisis. And from an animal's perspective, it's not just the mortality that the road inflicts, right? It's also the habitat fragmentation, the fact that these steady walls of vehicles are moving down these busy highways and preventing animals from even attempting to cross and thus completing their migration. Here's one example of that. One of the places I went working on this book was southwestern Wyoming, where there's this famous herd of mule deer who have to migrate 300 miles round trip to find food year round. And they never managed to cross I-80, the big interstate highway that runs across southern Wyoming. And during particularly harsh winters, because those deer can't reach a lot of their winter range, 40% of that herd will actually starve. Not because they were hit by cars, but because the road denied them habitat connectivity and prevented them getting where they need to go. So we have these two sort of linked problems, right? We have road mortality, the fact that all of these animals are being hit by cars and humans are being endangered as well. And we have habitat fragmentation, right? The fact that animals can't navigate the landscape. So how do we solve those two related issues? And really the best tool at our disposal are wildlife crossings, right? Overpasses, underpasses, those culverts I mentioned, all of these different structures that let animals safely move around the landscape. Here in the US, a lot of early wildlife crossings were built in the western states, like Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, for the reason that here in the West, our wildlife is often migratory. And if you get 1,000 mule deer crossing the same highway in Wyoming on the same migration corridor year after year, unfortunately, pretty soon there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put an underpass right here for the deer to find. Historically, those eastern states weren't really big adopters of wildlife crossings, but now states like Pennsylvania and New York and North Carolina are starting to look to Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Montana, California for inspiration, which is pretty exciting. Of course, people always ask, how do the deer know to use the crossings? And the answer is the fences make them, right? The idea is that you fence off that roadside. Those deer hit that fence line. They, pace the fence line for a quarter mile, looking for a crossing point, and then there's that underpass beckoning to them, right? So those two elements, the fences and the crossing structures, really work hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And that's where those culverts that I mentioned earlier come in. I think that when a lot of people think about wildlife crossings, they think about those big, beautiful, $20 million overpasses going over highways like the one that's going to be built over I-5 in Southern Oregon. And, certainly those structures are fantastic. But there's also lots of opportunity out there with the existing infrastructure that's already on the landscape, especially those culverts that I mentioned. So here's one example of that. This is a culvert under I-64 in Virginia, not a structure that was built explicitly for animals. This was built for the seasonal conveyance of water. But what the Virginia Department of Transportation realized is that, hey, we could fence off the highway on either side of that culvert and basically funnel deer to it and make them use it as an underpass. So that's what VDOT did, and they saw more than a 90% reduction in these dangerous, expensive deer crashes, fourfold increase in deer using that culvert as an underpass, along with black bears and foxes and opossums and other critters. And I think really relevantly for the department, that project recouped its own costs in under 2 years. Right? We were talking earlier about the extreme costs associated with animal crashes. And if you can build crossings and fences that prevent those expensive crashes, you can really save the public a lot of money very quickly. Wildlife crossings are great conservation investments, but they're also really sound fiscal investments as well. And that's a big part of why so many states are adopting them now, certainly including Oregon. So, I think that ultimately the task before us is to remake our infrastructure to save biodiversity, right? No pressure. But, we know we're in the middle of this sixth mass extinction crisis in planetary history, that roadkill is the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality on land. And that if we're going to save wildlife, here in the 21st century, we have to think about the costs of our roads. Here's one example of that. This is an underpass in South Texas, which is home to America's last ocelots. And 40% of ocelot mortality is roadkill, right? This is a species that we're losing right now because it can't safely cross roads. So, as Michelle mentioned, if this conversation just kind of piques your curiosity about, beavers or road ecology or any of it, I do have a couple of books out about this stuff. And, I think that one more unifying thread between these topics that Michelle mentioned before we jumped into this call was just how nonpartisan they are in a lot of ways, right? We know that wildlife crossings in particular enjoy more than 80% public support in states like Oregon and Colorado, which is just unfathomably high for a conservation initiative. And beavers too actually tend to be pretty nonpartisan. They're embraced by some of the conservative lawmakers that Sristi works with, as well as lots of ranchers in the West too. So these are two issues on which I think there's a lot of broad societal consensus, and I'm excited to hear what Sristi has to say about them. So thank you all so much, and looking forward to the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Ben. And again, hi everyone. I am Sristi Kamal, and I'm the Deputy Director at WELC, and I also have the very challenging task of being a following act to Ben, so bear with me here. I am going to try and share my screen. If you don't see it, just let me know. Michelle, I'm hoping you can see it.
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect.
You're good.
So again, we talked a little bit about these two specific issues, which is beavers and connectivity. And I'm going to try and bring them to the ground and how that plays out in policy world in Oregon. So the context will be Oregon here. But again, these policies can be mirrored in other places if the context makes sense. Michelle, at the beginning, or I think it was Jenna who mentioned that a lot of our staff are attorneys, and I'm one of the very few non-attorney staff. at WELC. So I work primarily at the legislature, at Fish and Wildlife Commission, the agency, and anything in between. But what drives WELC and our sort of strategic direction in our policy is what we call our Western Horizon, which is our sort of strategic vision for the organization. It has basically 3 prongs. One is the ecology of kinship. What that necessarily means is that we want to establish the interconnectedness between human and non-human communities. How do we keep that in our policy at the forefront, along with ecological, economical, and social values all at the same footing? What that also means is that we then transition our way of being in the society from being an extractionist society to a more kinship-centered society. And for that, we need policies and laws that reflect these values. So Ben talked a lot about, how beavers, there's a lot of focus on the impact that beavers can have on humans, but that's focusing entirely on the negative side of beavers and not necessarily on the positive side of beavers. So that's where we're kind of falling short a little bit on our laws and policies. So I'll use all my Oregon examples here. Again, I'll use 3 specific legislation that we have worked on regarding beavers, and then we'll talk a little bit about connectivity as well. But in Oregon, we are the beaver state. We call ourselves the beaver state. It is a keystone species. Ben did a remarkable job of walking through all the benefits that beavers bring, especially in Oregon. We have wildfire, we have drought, we have serious environmental impacts that are exacerbated right now by climate change. And so we know beavers can address most of these issues, or at least help reduce the impact of those issues. But beavers themselves are not an imperiled species. That means they're not listed species under the Endangered Species Act. So all of the policies around beaver and beaver management focus on the impact beavers can have on humans and human society and human infrastructure, like our agriculture, like our homes and roads and culverts. They do not focus at all on the benefits this species brings. So that's the lost ecology of kinship we have with this species in Oregon. One good example of that is the fact that beavers in Oregon were classified as predatory animal under the predatory animal statute that applies to private lands. This came about in the 90s, and Ben mentioned beavers are not predators in the sense they're not carnivores. The predatory animal classification is because of the impact on agriculture. The entire order of Rodentia was put into predatory animal, and that's where beavers went. But what that meant for the species is that you could kill the species all year round on private lands in Oregon, no restriction on how many. And also you do not need to report, or you don't need a permit to kill them, and you don't need to report after killing them. So that is entirely, again, dismissing the benefits the species brings. So we worked in 2 years ago in 2023, we focused on how do we undo this harm. So we had the Beaver Believer bill. Again, all of us are fans of Ben's book here. And what the bill did was it removed the beavers from the predatory animal statute in Oregon. By doing that, it moved the management over to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife instead of Oregon Department of Agriculture, which was managing the species. Department of Ag is not a agency that can manage fish and wildlife. So that's why it made more sense to move it back to ODFNW. It also meant that you could not kill beavers all year round. There were going to be hunting and trapping seasons like other species. And any other time you had to kill beavers on private lands, you have to get a permit from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, unless there is a threat to your crops or your infrastructure, like your barn or your parking lot. And regardless of why you killed a beaver, you'll still have to report the take or the killing of a beaver to ODFNW. So this was taking a step forward and undoing the harm that we've been doing for years on the species that does so much for Oregon. Now, building on that, so we did Beaver Believer, which was to stop the unregulated killing. We are building on that with Landowners Living with Beavers bill. It is trying to incentivize the landowners who have beavers on their property. So Ben talked about the beaver deceiver device and tree wrapping and pond levelers, and all those tools are available if a landowner wants to do it. But sometimes financial constraints stop you from trying those out. And the knee-jerk reaction for a landowner is to kill a beaver when it is causing some sort of damage on their property. We're trying to change that mindset by making financial resources available to landowners to do that. to try and use coexistence tools. And the other sort of important legislation we're working on this session is House Bill 3932, or what we call the Beaver and Water Quality Bill. So we were undoing the harm, and now we are doing policies that are trying to focus on the benefits that the species brings. So Oregon is fortunate to have over 310,000 miles of waterways, and DEQ only has survey data for half the state. So half the state doesn't even have survey data. But of the surveyed data, more than 120,000 miles are impaired under the Clean Water Act, as well as under EPA recommendations. Everything you see in purple on the map is what is basically impaired in Oregon under DEQ classification. Over 106,000 miles of those are on public lands. So what this bill is proposing is closing hunting and trapping of beavers on these waterways that are on public lands. Oregon has, for context, has the highest miles of impaired waterways in the whole country if you consider all water uses. So that's definitely a problem for Oregon. And so we're trying to solve it by making a more natural tool available, aka beavers, who do this job naturally. There are many reasons why DEQ deems waterways impaired in Oregon, but of the top 5 common ones, 4 beavers are known to solve. Those are high water temperature, sedimentation, dissolved oxygen, health of invertebrates. All of those beavers are known to address. So we're just trying to make this tool available to DEQ, a tool that already exists. Our public lands are degraded, our waterways on public lands are impaired, and we need beavers to be able to stay there long enough to do their job without getting trapped out. So this bill, again, has been moving through the legislature, but it is currently waiting in the Senate floor. It has been a lift for sure. This has a strong opposition from the trapping community. We have a small but pretty vocal trapping community in Oregon who would like this bill to not pass, but we've been able to move it along. It is currently waiting for a floor vote in the Senate. I was hoping I would have good news by now to be able to share with you all, but we're still kind of at the final stage here waiting for the final vote. And while this can seem like a new concept or something new, I mean, in Oregon, we have example of this already taking place at a city level. For example, the city of Gresham currently uses beavers in their stormwater cleanup facility to clean up stormwater in beavers in Gresham. And these waterways or the stormwater, one of the things they're doing is filtering out the pollutants. That's exactly what we want beavers to be able to do in other waterways in Oregon as well. The example of the city of Gresham was featured in Ben's article that came out in the current National Geographic issue. So if you haven't read that article, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing article on beavers that Ben had authored, and it does cite the example of the city of Gresham for the exact reason that we're trying to do this bill now for the whole state. So again, baby steps, policy is always incremental. So we did 3464 to undo the harm. We're trying to incentivize landowners to do coexistence on private lands, and we're trying to reap the benefits of beavers on public lands on our impaired waterways. And I'll now transition over to the connectivity piece, but I wanted to again leave you with this particular image also from Oregon. This is an image that Trout Unlimited took from the 2021 bootleg fire in Oregon. If you were in Oregon, this is the 3rd largest fire in Oregon's history, hundreds and thousands of acres burned. And you can see in this photo that everything around it is burned to the crisp. And the only thing that is lush and green is basically a beaver meadow with multiple beaver dam complexes. So if a picture is worth 1,000 words on how beavers can help us, this is one of those. And then moving over to connectivity, and again, Ben highlighted what are some of the challenges for wildlife and connectivity, and Oregon is definitely a victim to almost all of those. From WELC's perspective, we think of connectivity as crossing structures that Ben talked about, but also habitat connectivity and habitat restoration. You cannot build crossings and bridges that go to nowhere. You need to have good habitats on either side of those connectivity corridors you're trying to build. And then also landscape permeability, which means your current land use, whether it's urban, whether it's agricultural lands, allow animals to move through them in their current land use state. So all of these are elements of wildlife connectivity for us. Again, Ben already mentioned how big a problem this is, specifically in Oregon's context. We have over 7,000 wildlife vehicle collisions every year, and that's just the reported numbers. Most go unreported, like smaller mammals go unreported. Even like amphibians, reptiles go almost always unreported. So these are mostly largely big mammal collisions. And they, of course, cause serious injuries and unfortunately even fatalities every year. And these are super expensive collisions too. Like World Transportation Institute gave an estimate that every deer collision costs about $20,000, and that doesn't even include a few factors. So Oregon has like $114 million deer collision problem every year. So it's just for context how big a problem that is. And Oregon, amongst the Western states, is actually significantly lagging behind in crossing structures. Colorado has 69, California and Utah have 50 each, Washington has 30, Oregon has just 6. So we have definitely a ways to go there. And we know that these crossing structures work. Oregon has its own example. We have Highway 97, where a crossing project that was built showed that the collision number with deer went down over 90% in the first 2 years itself. Colorado has been an example. Banff have been an example. There's many examples of how properly sited collisions work, crossing structures work. It's just a matter of whether we are putting our resources there. In Oregon, we've been trying to move certain policies along to build on things we need for better connectivity in the state. But I'll say it started primarily in 2019 when the legislature passed a bill that made ODF&W develop a state wildlife corridor action plan and a connectivity map. This is the first map we ever had in the state on where the connectivity hotspots are or where the main connectivity corridors are. And then this map was shared with ODOT, our Department of Transportation, to take into their planning and implementation of projects into account. Since then, we've had one-time allocations or one-time funding for connectivity structures. There was a $7 million and then a separate $5 million. But these one-offs make it really hard to plan for big infrastructure projects. So what we're seeking in the state right now is a consistent stream of funding, essentially, for connectivity structures. So that brings us to where we are right now. There is so much uncertainty at the federal level. Ben mentioned about the I-5 crossing that Oregon was going to get. It was $33 million to be exact, a federal grant to build a crossing in Southern Oregon. The money didn't actually come through to ODOT, and they didn't necessarily sign any of the paperwork before the federal freeze. So the money is now stuck in limbo, and we don't necessarily have these crossing projects, which is why it's more important for the states to now step up. This is one example of that. And Oregon's legislative session is currently still on. And one of the biggest lift this session is our transportation package. And that transportation package just came out on Monday, which is yesterday. And that package has a $10 million or $5 million per year allocation for wildlife crossings at ODOT. If it passes, it's going to be very significant. That would make Oregon probably the second state with consistent source of funding for wildlife crossings, which is huge. And the other thing we worked on this session is also strengthening the connectedness between the two agencies, which is Oregon Department of Transportation and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife through another bill. And what they're trying to do is resource share and also share their expertise through trainings and workshops and other tools that each agency has, but there is lack of resources in the other one, and they're going to try and share their resources, basically. So that's what the House Bill 2978 does. So we've been, again, making slow progress, but definitely making progress in furthering better connectivity for wildlife in the state. But I'll say we still have a way to go in how we think about connectivity and habitat restoration around key wildlife corridors in the state, as well as our land use planning. And WELC doesn't necessarily work in the land use planning sphere, but we have a strong coalition of partners who do this connectivity work in the state, from the hunting and angling communities to wildlife conservation and advocacy groups like ours who all work together on this issue. This is one of those issues that actually brings people together that would otherwise not come together, which is amazing. But we still have a way to go. And these are some of the examples where we have been still able to move the needle with the constraints we have within the state. So I would like to end with the fact that when you think about policy, we think about it as sort of existing outside of where the rest of the public exists. It's happened, it's the legislature, it's the legislators. But I do want to emphasize that public engagement matters, and it matters a lot. So if you have the capacity or the ability to engage in the public processes of the legislature, I highly, highly recommend doing so, because the legislators do care about hearing from their constituents, and they need to hear more from constituents who care about wildlife in their districts. Wildlife often comes at a bottom list of priorities for most legislators, and anything we can do to elevate that and make it a priority for legislators will be really helpful in furthering good policies. And again, I highlighted some of the work we're doing, but none of this work exists in isolation without our partners. So I do want to give a shout out to our partners who make this work possible through coalitions and other partnerships that we work in. So with that, I will end my part, and maybe we can have a discussion on this. If I can just figure out, there we go.
Thank you so much, Ben and Sristi. Wonderful work both of you are doing. So we do have, time for questions. So I know there's a little bit of chatter in the chat, but also feel free to raise your hand and ask that question directly, and we can get those answered. And also, before we jump into that, I'm going to announce our winner of our lovely stainless steel WELC Cup, and that's Shian Meager. So Shian, I'll reach out to you about getting you your cup. But I can scroll down in this chat a little bit. I know there was a little chatter and they were answered, but maybe Ben, do you want to expand upon, in case people aren't following the chat? There was a question. Let me find it here, regarding if beaver dams prevent fish like salmon, which swim upstream to spawn, from arriving to where they need to go. And maybe if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question, and certainly a concern that some fish biologists and anglers have expressed over the years. And Jim had a great answer to that question, which is that beaver dams are leaky, right? They're nothing like the Bonneville Dam. Fish have all kinds of ways of getting over and around and through them. Fish are often migrating during periods of high flow when dams are being overtopped or outflanked by water. And in fact, there have been studies finding individual steelhead in the Columbia Basin in Oregon passing more than 200 beaver dams on their way to spawn. And in fact, that evolutionary connection between beavers and salmonids is so deep, right? These are animals that have been cohabitating on the landscape for, 8 million years, essentially, that inspired my favorite bumper sticker, which says, "Beavers taught salmon to jump." I really like that one. So, and as Jim pointed out too, I mean, we know that beaver restoration is one of the best tools we have for salmon restoration, right? That those beaver ponds are incredible rearing grounds for juvenile coho and steelhead in particular. So yeah, there's this wonderful connection between beavers and salmonids.
Great, thank you, Ben. And yeah, that was a really good question. So another question from the chat. So instead of killing beavers on private land, can those beavers be relocated to public lands that have low or no beaver populations?
That's a good question. Technically, the answer to that would be yes. You can relocate nuisance beavers from private lands onto public lands in Oregon. There are some permitting requirements that can make that a little bit challenging, like where on public lands you need permits from ODFNW and the Public Land Agency. So there are some hurdles there. And also, because of how social structure of a beaver family is, it is also important when relocation takes place that it is with the whole family, and there are other factors that go into that, predation. So the success rate of beavers surviving through relocation is actually not as high as we would like it to be. And many of these factors go into account there. And so, which is why we want beavers to stay where they are, because the point is that you have beavers on that private land because you have beaver suitable habitat on that private land. And so, and beavers are territorial in nature, which means that once you have a beaver family, they're likely going to keep out the other beavers that might come, just because of their nature. So it's a matter of figuring out how to live with the beaver family you have, not with all the beavers all around you. So it's not like you're going to have a beaver population explosion on your private land. So coexistence definitely helps with that. And that's why we try to encourage people to keep the beavers where they need to be, because also there is a need on private lands and waterways around private lands to have beavers stay there. Ben, if you wanted to add anything there.
Yeah, no, I think that, I think that Sristi's absolutely right. I think that, that a decade ago, lots of beaver conservation groups and agencies were really focused on relocation, which is, this great tool in the toolbox, right? Certainly preferable to killing the animals. But, as Sristi said, I think that, these days the understanding is, let's, instead of moving those animals, let's partner with them in the places that they're already choosing to live, and let's coexist with them on site rather than relocating. So relocation is, certainly a tool in the box, but, I agree with Sristi that the priority should always be coexistence where they already occur.
Thank you both for that. We'll go ahead with Melanie. You have your hand raised, so go ahead and ask your question whenever you're ready.
Yeah, my question has to do with hunting. If you move the beavers onto public land, can they still be hunted and killed? And is that, I would assume that's a matter of state law, but it also, the feds could do something about it. But are there any models for saying, okay, yeah, you can kill beavers, except on public lands where they've been relocated, if you can somehow delineate where they have been relocated to? Are there any models for applying some kind of considerations for beavers in hunting regulations?
That's a really good question. I can try and take a stab at it from the Pacific Northwest side. And Ben, if you have any information from Colorado or around that you're able to share, please do. But to answer your question, Melanie, yes, if they're relocated to public lands, then at least in Oregon, for example, the regular hunting and trapping seasons will apply to those beavers. Under whatever category they fall. For example, in Oregon, they would be fur bearers. So they would have the fur bearer hunting and trapping season apply there. And so it is a cost sunk if you spend so much money and resources in trying to relocate beavers from X place to Y place and they're just trapped out or hunted right away. So there has been some discussions I am aware of in Washington state where their conservation groups and other partners are discussing if there needs to be more sideboards onto areas where there is restoration priority for species like salmon, and beaver presence would help with that. And so should there be some sort of closures in those areas where beavers are being relocated to especially help with restoration? That hasn't necessarily translated into policy yet that I have seen. In Oregon, the beaver and water quality bill is exactly trying to do that. It is trying to focus in waterways where they are deemed impaired. Beavers can help with them, but can we stop them from getting hunted and trapped before they do the job they're needed to do there? So if this bill passes, it will put a closure on hunting and trapping of beavers on 107,000 miles of Oregon waterways. All of it is on public lands with the focus on water quality. So I think where Oregon's bill is focused on water quality, you can pick any of the other benefits that beavers bring and really focus on that in a policy to ask for better standards or sideboards on hunting and trapping of these species.
Thank you, Sristi. We had a handful of questions over in the chat. So Curious if ODFW has started assembling a priority list of needed wildlife crossings in anticipation of potentially getting some funding. And if so, what might be some of the top candidates? And then I had another question just on how they go about the prioritization of picking those wildlife crossings, if there is a process to that.
That's a good question. There is a list. It's not necessarily ODF and Ws, it's mostly Department of Transportation, because the crossing is an infrastructure that will be built through the Department of Transportation. But ODF and W's connectivity map weighs into that process now. There is a priority list. It depends on several things. For a few things are the species under consideration. So for example, mule deer migration is a problem in Oregon too. And so what can really support mule deer migration would therefore arise as a priority. But the other piece, and this is unfortunately the important piece, is the cost also. So there are projects that can be very small and can cost a few $1,000,000 to projects that can be like $50 million for a very big crossing infrastructure. They are known to be very wide in cost. So with the funding we have, it is a matter of prioritizing from the list of projects that we know are needed based on the connectivity map and where ODF and W or ODOT is building roads or currently roads exist, and how much money do we have. With federal funding being so limited, their focus right now is therefore, with the little money we have, which are the projects that we can do, and can this money over time be pooled? So like, instead of having 5 million per year, can you hold the money for 2 years, make it 10 million, and then build something? So there's a lot of math that goes into that, as well as the priority list that ODF and W has developed based on the connectivity map. There is a list that I'm happy to share. If you just email me, I can send you the list of the priority projects.
Yeah, and I think that the process of prioritization of sites, and this is a broad answer compared to Sristi's specific one to Oregon, but John Haber, I noticed, mentioned asked whether there's a role for conservation easements to protect access to crossing structures. I think that's when when Sristi talks about the different data layers or priorities that go into identifying worthy candidates for wildlife crossings. Certainly the conservation of land on either side of the road is a really important consideration, right? As Sristi mentioned in her presentation, if you build a wildlife crossing and then suddenly either side of that highway gets developed into condos, now you've got a bridge to nowhere, right? And so that's where those conservation easements are so important, is can we protect the valley bottom on either side of the roadway immediately, and thereby connect these bigger blocks of public land that generally move away from those valley bottoms. And so easements are kind of a vital tool. And there are certainly sites here in Colorado where folks are trying to get conservation easements at places that CDOT has identified as critical sites for crossings.
Definitely. Thank you for that one. We have kind of a variety of questions going on, but maybe Sristi or Ben, if you have any resources, folks were wondering what they can do and to engage in their area. If there's any sort of particular groups. I know, Ben, you had mentioned the Colorado Beaver Working Group. There was, I think, New York and Wyoming maybe, but just if there's any that you would recommend resources to find ways to get involved to advocate for beavers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that beavers. I'd advocate checking out the Beaver Institute, which I mentioned earlier. They know they've got lots of great resources on beaver coexistence, and I often point landowners towards TBI because they've got all these great fact sheets about how to install your own pond level or that sort of thing. On the connectivity front, I mean, look, I think that one of the really fantastic things about the issue of wildlife crossings is that it's such a ripe area for doing the good citizen thing, right? For calling you or writing your elected officials, because it truly is nonpartisan. Wildlife crossings are one of those rare issues that unite the hunting lobby and the Humane Society, right? And so they're nonpartisan. Politicians tend to like them because there's often a ribbon cutting, and so I do think it's one of those things where your elected officials are really responsive, to concerns about habitat connectivity and wildlife vehicle collisions in your community. So I'd encourage you to reach out to those officials. And then Sristi mentioned that big $350 million wildlife crossings pilot program. Some of those funds are stuck in limbo. Some have been released. So hopefully, that I-5 money is forthcoming. But, that program is a pilot program, right? And it's basically expiring this year. And, the hope is to make it a permanent program, ideally at a higher funding level, in 2026, when the next iteration of the big surface transportation bill is authorized. And so, I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for that debate too, because a year from now, calling your representatives and saying, hey, we need that wildlife crossings pilot program to be made permanent, in the next transportation authorization bill. That's going to be a huge, I don't want to say battle, but an issue upcoming, for federal funding for wildlife crossings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll second what Ben said, and I'll say that from like a state's perspective, anything you can do to emphasize how important this is to your decision makers, because every federal funding almost requires state match at some capacity. So for your state to be able to access some of those federal grants, they'll still need to put up some of their money. And if you don't have any state money to begin with for crossings, then you miss out on opportunities at the federal level. So this is why it's also important for the states to step up when federal opportunities arise through funding.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good note to end on since we're at the hour, but just echoing Ben and Sristi of how important it is to get engaged. It really does make a huge difference. I know it can be intimidating sometimes, calling your legislator or going to the Capitol, but it's really not. And it's a really wonderful experience. So phone a friend, tell them to call your legislator, look them up in your area. It truly does make a really big difference for all these important things that we care about. So yeah, so just with that, yeah, we'll end our call, but just again, gratitude. Thank you so much, Ben, again, for showing up here and chatting to us about your books. I know we got a lot of Beaver Believers and Crossing fans on the call. And Sristi, as always, for all the critical work that you're doing. It's just remarkable and you're awesome. And lastly, very important, but thank you to all of our supporters. Like we said before, WELC is a nonprofit. Wouldn't be able to do this work without our supporters. So we just are super grateful for you showing up here today. And yeah, just a lot of gratitude all around. And the recording for this will be circulated to anyone that registered. So feel free to share it or send it to a friend or anything like that. But Ben or Sristi, do you have anything else to add?
No, thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Really good turnout. So really appreciate your interest on these issues.
Well, all right. Well, have a great day, everyone. And thanks again. Bye.
Take care. Bye.